The sound of my bridge being destroyed was like someone ripping my heart out with a chainsaw. I'm standing in my backyard at 6 a.m., coffee mug in hand, watching a demolition crew turn 3 months of my blood, sweat, and weekend mornings into floating splinters. The woman supervising this destruction? Margaret Whitman, HOA president and professional dream crusher, standing on her $1 million deck with her arms crossed like she just won the lottery. When she spotted me watching, she actually had the nerve to wave. Like we were neighbors saying good morning instead of her destroying the one thing that kept me sane after my divorce. Let me tell you how this whole mess started, because trust me, by the time I'm done with Margaret and her precious HOA, that wave is going to be the most expensive gesture of her life. 6 months ago, I bought a house in Willowbrook Estates for $380,000. Not because I'm rich, I'm a plumber for crying out loud, but because my ex-wife got the good house in the divorce and I needed somewhere to start over. The realtor kept going on about the exclusive lakefront community and premium lifestyle, but honestly, I just wanted a place where I could fish and maybe build something with my hands again. The house came with a backyard that sloped down to Lake Harmony, this artificial lake they built in the 90s. Pretty enough, but what caught my eye was the potential. See, there was this perfect spot where I could build a small bridge from my yard to a little fishing dock. Nothing fancy, just a simple wooden walkway where I could sit with my morning coffee and pretend my life wasn't falling apart. Building that bridge became my therapy. Every Saturday morning I'd wake up at dawn and work on it. Hand-cut railings, pressure-treated lumber, even carved a little fish design into the side posts because why not? After 12 years of marriage ending with my wife telling me I never built anything beautiful, this bridge was going to be my masterpiece. For 3 months I poured everything into that project. My neighbor Tom would bring me coffee and offer unsolicited advice about wood stain colors. Mrs. Chun from across the street would wave from her garden and tell me it was looking beautiful. Even the mailman started commenting on my progress. The bridge wasn't just wood and nails, it was proof that I could create something good, something lasting. When I finally finished it, I sat there every morning for 2 weeks straight, watching the sunrise over the water and feeling like maybe, just maybe, I was going to be okay. That's when I got the letter. The envelope was crisp white with gold letterhead, Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. Inside was the most politely worded declaration of war I'd ever read. Dear Mr. Rodriguez, it began, it has come to our attention that you have constructed an unauthorized structure extending into Lake Harmony. This bridge constitutes a violation of HOA regulations regarding waterfront modifications and must be removed within 10 business days. It was signed Margaret Whitman, HOA President, in handwriting that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. I read that letter 3 times, each time getting angrier. Unauthorized structure? I checked the HOA rules before building. Nothing about bridges. Nothing about lake access. The only thing I could find was some vague language about maintaining the aesthetic integrity of the community. So I did what any reasonable person would do. I called Margaret to discuss it like adults. Big mistake. Margaret Whitman lives in the biggest house in the development, a $2.1 million lakefront mansion that looks like it was designed by someone who thought too much wasn't a real concept. When I rang her doorbell, she answered wearing what I can only describe as rich lady casual, clothes that probably cost more than my car but were designed to look effortless. Mr. Rodriguez, she said with a smile that never reached her eyes, I was wondering when you'd call. She invited me into her living room, which looked like a furniture showroom where everything was beige and nobody had ever actually lived. The coffee she offered came from a machine that probably required a PhD to operate. I'm sure you understand, she began, settling into a chair that cost more than most people's monthly rent, that Willowbrook Estates is a premium community. We have certain standards to maintain. Your little construction project simply doesn't align with our vision. Little construction project. 3 months of work and she called it a little construction project. I tried to be reasonable. I explained that I'd checked the rules, that the bridge was well built and safe, that it actually added to the natural beauty of the lake. I even offered to modify the design if she had specific concerns. Margaret's expression got colder with every word I spoke. This isn't a negotiation, she finally said, her polite mask slipping. This is a premium community, not your personal workshop. The bridge goes or you'll face escalating fines. And trust me, Mr. Rodriguez, I have very deep pockets for legal fees. That's when I knew this wasn't about rules or aesthetics. This was about power. Margaret Whitman was the kind of person who needed to control everything in her little kingdom, and my bridge represented something she couldn't control. Someone doing what they wanted on their own property. Fine, I said, standing up. But don't expect me to just roll over. Her smile returned, shark-like and cold. I wouldn't dream of it. Makes things so much more interesting. 2 weeks later, I came home from work to find my bridge being destroyed. Not removed. Destroyed. They could have taken it apart carefully, maybe even let me keep the wood. Instead, they brought in a demolition crew with chainsaws and sledgehammers who turned my 3 months of work into floating debris in about 20 minutes. Margaret stood on her deck the entire time, watching. When our eyes met across the water, she raised her coffee mug in a little toast. That's when something cold and calculating settled in my chest. You want to play games, Margaret? Let's play games. The first thing I did was research everything I could about Margaret Whitman and the HOA. What I found was interesting. Margaret had been HOA president for 8 years, ever since she and her husband bought their mansion. In that time, she'd issued over 200 fines for various violations. Everything from wrong mailbox colors to unauthorized garden gnomes. The woman was like a one-person violation detection machine. But here's what really caught my attention: the lake. Lake Harmony wasn't natural. It was created in 1995 when the developers dammed a small creek that ran through the property. The dam was old, the maintenance records were spotty, and according to county records, there had been several complaints over the years about water quality and strange odors during low water periods. Most interesting of all? Margaret's husband, Richard Whitman, was on the board of directors for Whitman Construction, the company that had built the dam. I'm a plumber. I know water systems. And I was starting to get a very interesting idea. Tom Henderson from next door turned out to be my first ally. He came over the day after my bridge was destroyed with a 6-pack of beer and a list of grievances against the HOA that was longer than my arm. That woman fined me $500 last month, he said, settling into one of my patio chairs. Know why? Because my fence was 6 inches too tall. 6 inches. I measured it myself. It was exactly 6 feet, which is what the rules say. But apparently Margaret decided the rules meant under 6 feet, not 6 feet. Mrs. Chin joined us an hour later, followed by the Johnsons from down the street. Before I knew it, I had a whole support group of people who'd been terrorized by Margaret's HOA reign. She made me replace my mailbox 3 times, Mrs. Chin said, shaking her head. First it was the wrong shade of black. Then it was positioned 2 inches too close to the street. Finally, she decided the style wasn't compatible with the community aesthetic. The Johnsons had been fined for planting roses instead of tulips in their front garden. Apparently, Margaret had decided on a coordinated spring color scheme, without actually telling anyone what colors were approved. But the most interesting story came from old Mr. Peterson, who'd lived in the development since it was built. That lake's been nothing but trouble, he said, lowering his voice like we were sharing state secrets. Every few years the water level drops and you can smell something chemical. My wife always said there was something wrong with that water, but whenever anyone complained, the HOA would schedule routine maintenance, and the problems would disappear. What kind of maintenance? I asked. That's just it, Peterson said. Nobody ever saw any actual maintenance. Just trucks coming and going, and then everything would be fine for another year or two. That night, I sat in my backyard staring at the spot where my bridge used to be, thinking about Margaret's little toast and Peterson's story about the lake. I'm not usually a vengeful person. I believe in live and let live, fix what's broken and move on with life. But Margaret had made this personal when she destroyed something I'd built with my own hands. And if there was something fishy about that lake, well, sometimes the best revenge is just shining a light on the truth. I started small. A few phone calls to the county planning office, some questions about water quality testing, basic stuff that any concerned homeowner might ask. What I found was disturbing. Lake Harmony had never been properly tested for water quality. The original environmental impact study from 1995 was missing several pages. There were no records of any maintenance on the dam since 2003. And most interesting of all, Whitman Construction had been cited by the EPA in 1994 for improper disposal of construction chemicals at 3 other sites. I'm not a detective, but I know how to read between the lines. And the lines were telling me that Margaret's precious lake might be sitting on top of a very expensive problem. Time to do a little field work. I waited until 2 a.m. on a moonless night, then put on my wetsuit and went for a little swim in Lake Harmony. The water felt wrong immediately. Too warm in some spots, too cold in others, and there was a slight oily feel that shouldn't exist in a freshwater lake. When I dove down to examine the dam structure, I found what I was looking for. Cracks. Lots of them. The concrete was old, poorly maintained, and leaking in several places. But more importantly, I could see dark stains in the sediment around the dam that looked suspiciously like chemical contamination. I took water samples from several locations, including right next to the dam where the staining was worst. Then I carefully photographed everything with my underwater camera. Back home, I researched water testing labs and found one that would test for industrial chemicals without asking too many questions about why I wanted to know. The results came back a week later and confirmed my suspicions. High levels of petroleum-based solvents, construction chemicals, and several compounds that had no business being in any water that people lived near. Lake Harmony wasn't just a pretty water feature. It was a toxic waste dump with a dam that was one heavy rain away from catastrophic failure. And Margaret Whitman almost certainly knew it. I spent the next month carefully documenting everything. Water test results, photos of the dam damage, county records, EPA violations. I built a case that would make any environmental lawyer drool. But I didn't want to just expose the truth. I wanted Margaret to experience the same feeling I'd had watching my bridge get destroyed. I wanted her to stand helpless while something she valued got taken away. The plan I came up with was beautiful in its simplicity. The lake level was controlled by a spillway system built into the dam. During heavy rains, excess water would flow out through the spillway to prevent the dam from overflowing. But the spillway could also be opened manually for maintenance purposes. All I had to do was open that spillway and let the lake drain itself. I picked a Friday night in late September when the weather forecast called for a dry week. Margaret and most of the other lakefront homeowners were hosting some kind of charity gala at the country club, which gave me the perfect window. The spillway controls were protected by a simple padlock that my bolt cutters handled easily. The mechanism itself was old but functional, and within minutes I had water flowing out of Lake Harmony at its maximum rate. The beauty of the plan was that it would take several days for the water level to drop enough to be noticeable, and by then it would be too late to stop without major equipment. I went home, made some popcorn, and waited for the show to begin. Chapter 10, The Reveal. Saturday morning brought the first panicked phone calls. By noon, half the neighborhood was standing on their docks trying to figure out why the water level was dropping. Margaret's response was swift and predictable. She sent out an emergency email to all residents explaining that the lake was experiencing temporary drainage due to seasonal maintenance, and that water levels would return to normal within a few days. But Sunday brought a development that I hadn't expected. With the water level down about 3 feet, the contaminated sediment around the dam was starting to become visible. And it didn't just look bad, it smelled terrible. By Monday morning, the smell was strong enough that people were starting to ask questions Margaret couldn't answer with vague references to seasonal maintenance. That's when I made my move. I started with an anonymous tip to the county environmental health department, complete with water test results and photos of the contaminated sediment that was now visible around the dam. Then I sent copies of everything to the local newspaper, the EPA, and a law firm that specialized in environmental contamination cases. But the real masterstroke was the email I sent to every resident in Willowbrook Estates. Fellow homeowners, it began, I think we all deserve to know the truth about what's been hidden under our beautiful lake. I included photos of the contaminated sediment, summaries of the water test results, and copies of the EPA violations against Whitman Construction. I ended with a simple question: why has our HOA been covering this up? The response was immediate and explosive. Tuesday brought news crews. Wednesday brought EPA investigators. Thursday brought a class action lawsuit. By Friday, Margaret Whitman's perfect little kingdom was in complete chaos. The EPA investigation confirmed everything I'd documented and more. Lake Harmony was sitting on top of decades of improperly disposed construction chemicals. The dam was structurally unsound and had been leaking contaminated water into the groundwater for years. Most damning of all, they found evidence that the HOA had known about the problems for over a decade and had been covering them up with cosmetic fixes and intimidation tactics. Margaret tried damage control, but it was too late. The news story had gone viral, with headlines like, "Toxic HOA President Covered Up Environmental Disaster," and "Million-Dollar Mansions Built on Poison Lake." Property values didn't just drop, they collapsed completely. Who wants to buy a lakefront mansion when the lake is a contaminated waste dump? Chapter 13, The Reckoning. The final blow came when the county ordered an emergency evacuation of all properties within 500 feet of the lake pending environmental remediation. Margaret's $2.1 million mansion? Worthless and uninhabitable. The Hendersons' place? Same. Every single one of those lakefront properties that had been used to justify Margaret's tyrannical HOA rules? Condemned until further notice. But here's the beautiful part. My house was just outside the 500-foot evacuation zone. Close enough to have seen everything unfold, but far enough away to be unaffected by the contamination. I got to stay and watch the aftermath. The criminal charges against Margaret and the HOA board came 6 months later. Conspiracy to violate environmental laws, fraud, racketeering. The prosecutors threw everything they could think of at them. Margaret pled guilty to avoid a longer sentence, but she still got 18 months in federal prison and personal liability for $12 million in cleanup costs and damages. Her husband's construction company went bankrupt within a year. The lakefront mansion they'd been so proud of? Demolished as part of the environmental cleanup. But the most satisfying moment came during Margaret's sentencing hearing when the judge asked if she had anything to say to the victims of her cover-up. "Your Honor," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I was just trying to protect property values." The judge wasn't impressed. "Ms. Whitman, you protected property values by poisoning your neighbor's drinking water and covering up environmental crimes for over a decade. That's not community leadership, that's sociopathic behavior." 2 years later, Lake Harmony is gone. In its place is a beautiful wetland preserve where the contaminated soil has been replaced with clean earth and native plants. The county turned it into a public park with walking trails and educational signs about environmental protection. I still live in my house, which is now worth more than ever thanks to its proximity to the new park. I built a new bridge, this one leading from my backyard to the walking trail. Nobody complained about permits or HOA regulations because there's no HOA anymore. It was dissolved as part of the criminal settlement. The best part? I used some of the wood from my original bridge, which I'd carefully salvaged from the lake after Margaret had it destroyed. Every morning, I sit on that bridge with my coffee and think about how sometimes the best revenge is just letting the truth come to light. Margaret Whitman tried to destroy something I'd built with my own hands because it challenged her authority. In the end, her need for control destroyed everything she'd worked to build and protect. The day Margaret was released from prison, she drove slowly past my house on her way out of town. I was sitting on my new bridge, enjoying my morning coffee and reading the newspaper story about the park's grand opening. She stopped her car and rolled down the window. "Are you happy now?" she called out. I looked at this woman who had once seemed so powerful and intimidating, now broken and defeated, asking me if I was happy about her downfall. "Margaret," I said, raising my coffee mug in the same little toast she'd given me 2 years earlier, "I didn't destroy your life. You did that all by yourself when you decided that maintaining appearances was more important than telling the truth." She drove away without another word, and I never saw her again. That evening, Tom Henderson came over with a six-pack to help me celebrate the park opening. We sat on my bridge, watching families walk the new trails where the toxic lake used to be. "You know," Tom said, "I never thought I'd thank someone for draining a lake, but here we are." I laughed. Sometimes you have to tear something down before you can build something better. And that's exactly what happened. Margaret Whitman thought she could destroy my bridge and intimidate me into submission. Instead, she taught me that some battles are worth fighting, especially when you're fighting for the truth. The bridge she destroyed was just wood and nails. The community we built in its place is something much stronger and more lasting. So if you're dealing with your own Margaret Whitman, someone who thinks power gives them the right to destroy what others have built, remember this. The truth has a way of rising to the surface no matter how deep you try to bury it. Sometimes the best revenge is just opening the floodgates and letting it flow. If you enjoyed this story of justice served cold and wet, let me know in the comments. Have you ever had to deal with an out-of-control HOA or neighborhood tyrant? Share your stories below. And remember, sometimes the most powerful weapon against bullies is simply refusing to stay silent.